So what are we going to do tonight? We're going to conclude what is this semester's set of classes, and they come together at the point where we have to figure out how do we actually make a business that's going to be either profitable or sustainable. I know a lot of you have not-for-profit ventures, and so we also have a not-for-profit case example tonight, and delighted to have Jason here to talk about that. But what we want to make sure is that before you go too far, too fast down the process of taking your product to market, that you think about what's the way that you're actually going to create the value and how you're actually going to deliver that value and harness it in a way that makes your business really sustainable. So that's really what this is about. But before I go there, as usual, the value is not me talking. It's me setting up the guest speakers tonight with the framework. And so I want to quickly introduce everybody, if they could just be ready to stand up. We've got Acquia's CFO here, Dennis Morgan. Dennis, welcome. Good to have you here. We've got from Formlabs, Max. Good to have you, Max. From Diagnostics for All, Jason Rolland. Nice to have you here. And from OpEx Engine, Lauren Kelly. Great to have you, Lauren. So at different points tonight, we're going to introduce what they do. And so don't worry if you haven't got a handle on that right now. We're going to be able to introduce them with context tonight. And the agenda is going to be at the simplest level to help you think about how you will find a disruptive business model. And one of the reasons that that's so important is that what you do is often not going to be fully valued until you do that. So think about how are you going to get the value that you build actually received in a way that helps you build a company. And it requires us finding what we talk about here as your core differentiation, and then two key concepts around that. How do you multiply it and lever it with innovation in the way in which you either build, for example, the product or you deliver it to market. And one of the things that we had a lot of feedback on the original first couple of years of doing this was people really are thinking in many instances at this stage about how do they design their product to build that value. So tonight we're not covering that because, this is good news, we ended up making a whole new section about that called Products to Companies. How do you turn products into companies? And we gave our first workshop on that last year in the spring. So those of you who want to see that, that's online, again, at mjskok.com or on Harvard iLab site. And you can see more of that information there because it's certainly a key part of what you do in terms of building the product and designing it to actually fit your business model. But we're not covering it tonight because it ended up being, as I said, such a highly requested thing, we broke it out. Now, the other side of the coin, which people should know about, is coming up in the spring session, so next semester, is how do we actually take products to market? And that's often a key part of your business model. So again, we don't cover that tonight because it's a big subject, and it's broken into things like, for example, strategic positioning, segmentation, channels, etc. So for those of you who are interested in that, that's coming up in the spring. All right, let's jump right in. Business model is typically about how do you make money, and even if you're a not-for-profit, the key thing is you've got to figure out the three components of your business model. How do you create your value, how do you deliver it, and how do you harness it? And it's really a key opportunity to step back and say, what can you do in this regard that is not just me too, but how can it be disruptive? And for me, this means things like, what are the important ways that you can reduce your time to market, get your market adoption down, and make it sustainable? And for an entrepreneur, these are key things because if you build a brilliant product but it isn't adopted easily and it costs too much to deliver it, then you're very quickly going to get frustrated with the challenges that obviously you want to get over of how do you get customer feedback quickly, how do you actually get the momentum going in the marketplace to try and build a position that you can actually sustain. So the connecting the dots for you as a founder, what I want you to try and think about is this is so core, it's so critical to you that if you get it wrong, you're going to spend more, you're obviously going to take more cash as a result, your ownership or your potential stake in the company is going to go down, and it's also going to reduce things like your valuation. But by contrast, and I've got some very specific things on the website that talk to this, for example, if you get your business model right, it can drive significant value in your business, and you can be valued higher just because of the way in which you take your products to market and the way in which you think about your business model. And there's a whole section on that on my site, which we did in conjunction with Goldman Sachs, which I'm not going to go into detail on tonight. But it points out that those companies that get their business model right can have literally 5 to 10x higher valuations than those that don't. So think about that for a second. You're doing all this great stuff to produce your value prop, which we've been through in some of the other sessions, but now somehow somebody does something smarter than you in their business model and they're worth 10 times more than you. How did that happen? Well, it does happen. It happens all the time. And that's why this is such an important session and one in which we want to get you started thinking about it. Now, the startup world is different. So I specifically want you to think about this tonight in different ways than, for example, you would approach this if you were a larger company. Larger companies have constraints, and they, in many instances, have customers, and those are, whether they like it or not, a restraint to what they can do. But as a startup, you have none of that. You literally are not constrained at all. You're not constrained by any past practices. And so you can think completely out of the box about what could you do to differentiate your business model. And I like to think about this as sort of a three-part, and it could be multi-part, but three in particular part. You've got a disruptive business model, but obviously you hope to build something in the way of a discontinuous innovation. Either that's your product or your service. And in the go-to-market piece that comes next semester, we'll talk about how if you can get that segmented to target a new white space, you really end up having a perfect storm. Because at that point, it's very hard for somebody to come after you. You're disrupting the way in which you're delivering something as well as what you're delivering, and you're doing it in a space that's as yet untaken. So this is why I call this the startup storm, the perfect startup storm, but it's also not going to stand alone. For example, if you built a brilliant business model, but you really hadn't figured out how to identify the right segment and how to get it to market, to lead that segment, it's not going to stand alone on its own right. It's a piece of the puzzle. Think of it as a three-legged stool, and this is one of the key legs. But I will say this, and this is quite rare that you'll hear me be so emphatic about it. Most of the time, I hear people saying that I've got an absolutely breakthrough product or service, and they don't even think about these other two. They believe that the better mousetrap is going to cause people to beat a path to their door. Not only do I not think that's true, but I will tell you a lot of the best businesses that are being built right now don't even have this. They're actually the same kinds of products and services, but they've got a fundamental disruptive business model. And that's what changes the game. Now, if you don't believe me, next month, we're going to have the CEO of a little company, Red Hat, come and tell us how they took basically a commodity product, actually a free product called Linux, and built what's now a $10 billion valued business. So he's coming to talk about that case example, and you're all invited, so you get a chance to hear that. And there is very little that was truly innovative about Linux at one level, in the sense that it was just another operating system. And in many instances, it was way behind the operating systems that it was competing with at the time, such as Solaris from Sun, etc. But what was differentiated was their business model. And that's what enabled them to break in. So it's why I want you to pay attention to this. So how can your business model literally change the game the way Red Hat did, or rewrite the rules and say we're going to give something away and create an innovator's dilemma? Obviously, Clayton Christensen does a wonderful job of explaining the innovator's dilemma syndrome, so I'm not going to get into it, but the net of it is that you basically create something that interrupts people's traditional business as usual and causes a path that they can't follow. And when you think about the business model, there are so many ways that you can do that. And as I said, I believe it can be at least as disruptive as your technology, in many instances more disruptive. But let me pause here for a second. Just think about this. Would you rather walk onto a playing field where you've got to play by a whole bunch of rules that you've never heard of that the competitor set out for you, and you've got to figure out on the fly, what are the different plays that will work? Or would you rather walk out there and change the whole playing field around, reorient it, set out your rules for yourself, and then let the competitors on and come and figure out how to play by your rules? Obvious, right? You're going to want to do the latter. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you stepping back and saying, how could you rewrite or literally create a whole new game in which everybody else has to come and learn to play by your rules? That's what business models are all about. So I'm too old to be able to do anything other than to give you my history here. And I'm going to date myself very quickly by telling you a story that's well over 20 years ago. So in fact, when I first gave this case example, it happened to be the 20th anniversary of Symantec. And a bunch of us got together and we pulled out some of these old mementos of products we used to sell in those days. But before I go any further, does anybody even know who Symantec is these days? Who knows Symantec? Oh, good. All right. So I guess we created somewhat of an enduring company. It's a multi-billion-dollar company today. But in these days, by the way, to give you a sense of it, our revenue was less than 50 million. In fact, a lot less. I think we were only about $20, $30 million. And we had a product that was the best-selling antivirus product for the Macintosh. And so we were quite excited about that. We thought it was awesome. And in those days, when you're under 50 million, if you're doing $5 million of revenue in any product, you think it's big. And trust me, we thought we were like the bee's knees. We thought we would, we'd broken through. But a funny thing happened. We realized that actually we really weren't actually seeing the wood for the trees here, in that the real marketplace was on the PC, because that operating system was much more vulnerable. And so as viruses started to come out on the PC, of course, we said we need to bring out an antivirus product. And so we did. Those of you know, we also acquired a company called Peter Norton way back then. Turned out to be a very critical thing that we did for the company. And so we changed the brand from Symantec to Norton. And that was because Peter Norton was better known in those days for things like utilities. And again, just to date people here, how many people have ever used a Peter Norton product, would even know what that is? Oh, good, there's a few of you, quite a few. Okay, so it used to be used for things like disk recovery and backup and things like that. So we changed the brand. That was the easy part. And that certainly helped. But let me tell you, what really changed was much, much more interesting. It was the business model. Now, looking as where we are today backwards, this is going to seem so obvious. But at that time, nobody had ever thought about giving away software free. There wasn't such a thing. We just didn't do freemium models. There wasn't the web. So giving away software actually cost you something. You had to manufacture this stuff and ship it to people. So there was real cost in it. But that's what my team decided to do. And in fact, we had a tremendous amount of debate internally. There was all sorts of challenges about, well, should we do that over in the UK, which is where we were based, or should we do that in the US, and where should we test this thing, and what happens if everybody decides that this is really, you know, a new trend and we can't make money? I mean, it was terrifying. But anyway, we decided to do it. And what we did was, we turned this into basically a Trojan horse. We said, we'll give away the antivirus software, because guess what? Where's the value? Think about it for a second. Is it the actual software? Or is it being able to scan and pick up the virus? It's in the definition of the virus. And what was really going on then was there was just more and more and more and more viruses coming out. And so by giving away the Trojan horse and saying, no, you pay a subscription when the new viruses come out, we started to collect the real value. And it just completely turned the industry on its head. And I will tell you, it was a turning point for Symantec. It changed everybody's rules. And we had rewritten effectively at that point how we competed. And we had a competitor called Central Point, who we basically put out of business. And you can talk about all sorts of different things about what shaped companies, but I'll tell you that was a defining moment for what's now a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm not saying it was the only one, because there's a ton of execution and many other things, but it was a critical one and had nothing to do with technology, zero. So this is why this is so important. Okay, the results, just to put it on the simplicity of what we're talking about today, also drove the bottom line all the way down to a predictable, profitable business model. Because now, instead of worrying about how many units do we sell of our software every month, we got that out as far and wide as we could. We didn't care about how we distributed. All we needed to worry about was how quickly could we turn these virus definitions around. And we knew that basically as they started to come out more and more rapidly, we basically would end up having a monthly subscription service. And guess what? People don't want to turn off their virus software. Especially back then, by the way, it was pretty potent. So we had a very predictable monthly recurring revenue model. And that, now back to value, became highly valuable. And Lauren's going to talk about this later on. But the more predictable your business is, the more valuable it is. It's as simple as that. So a very exciting thing. Now, there was a follow-on. Everybody started talking in our company about, hey, this business model thing's kind of cool. Actually, we didn't use those terms in those days because I hadn't been to Harvard. I wasn't smart enough. So we would talk about things like, well, how do we get more revenue out of our customers? And so we did something really interesting. We said, you know what, the customers aren't really buying virus software. What they're really buying is protection for their data. So why don't we talk about that? And we took out full-page ads. By the way, I was not an investor in these days. And my board had a heart attack when I told them I was going to take full-page ads out in things like the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times. They're like, are you kidding me? How can you afford to do that? But we needed to do it. We went on radio and TV and God knows what else to change the game, to talk about what the customers cared about, which was data security. And we took a thought leadership position instead of a feature position. Because as it turned out, it's okay to talk about this 20 years later because it was embarrassing at the time, our virus software was not that great. It turned out that there's a little guy called Dr. Solomon in the UK who was doing a better job of this with about a tenth of the number of people, and his virus software was actually better than ours. It was like, yee, what are we going to do about this? So instead of getting into a feature war with him, we turned this thing into, no, we are the best data protection company. And actually what we did was we got customers to believe that we had a complete suite of products. We called it the total solution. That did everything from protect your data from viruses, to doing backup, to being able to restore your data, all sorts of things. So the game became a much bigger thing, which was really a business benefit. And the result of all of that was really exciting. In fact, I can be very specific about it. We used to sell 1.5 products per customer, in other words, per seat, of all of our different products, of our backup and all these other tools. And because of doing this campaign, it went up to 2.6x. So in today's world, we talk about this as upsell. So we got a 2.6x upsell on customers versus 1.5. It was huge. It just meant like our revenues went from a very unpredictable, we've got to sell one product at a time and try to sell the add-on, to this extremely predictable subscription-based model where we're selling 2.6x more. You can imagine what that did to the company. We went public off it. That's the bottom line. And this is the kind of thing that is game-changing for companies. And yeah, I know the story is 20 years old, but I can tell you it still plays today. And what's interesting about it is that we talk about these things in more specific terms like retention and upsell today, but it's the same fundamental set of principles. So Lauren will be here again to give you some examples that are more real. Okay, you're starting to get convinced more about business model? Getting a sense that this is actually important? I see some nodding heads. The rest of you enjoying your dinner. Good. So I've got one more example, and it has zero to do with products. So as it turned out, the setup of Symantec itself was a different business model. So it was in a company I'd started called European Software Publishing. And the idea here was that we would actually create an off-balance sheet model to bring companies to market. The idea here was this. Symantec themselves had actually been very successful in the US, but had multiple times brought their products into Europe through distributors. And distributors do exactly what that moniker sounds like. They distribute stuff, but they don't localize, they don't translate, they don't support, and they basically don't provide a tangible presence for major customers like, for example, British Petroleum and others that we had to feel comfortable there was a company there. So the problem is that if you're Symantec and you're only about a $20, $30 million company and you're trying to get ready to go public, to go and set up an organization in Europe is very costly. It actually costs both time, energy, management, as well as real dollars, and it also hits your P&L. And so it's not a very easy thing to do when you're trying to get yourself profitable, which you had to do in those days, by the way, before you went public. So what we did is we went along and said, you know what, we'll do this all off balance sheet for you. We'll create some fun terms. We'll make it possible, you can't do this all today, tax rules have changed, but we'll make it possible to be a pooling of interest, which basically was a tax advantage. Non-dilutive, so when you buy us back, when we set up Symantec over there, you buy us back, it's accretive to your earnings per share. And so you can grow your earnings so everybody's going to win. And that's exactly what happened. These two huge Bibles that sit on my shelf are the actual deal. So I didn't enjoy the legal work, I have to say, that went into this. That happened, but the outcome was a huge win-win. In fact, customers got better local product support and services by setting it up. The publishers, Symantec themselves, were accelerated to getting their profitability and their growth in the marketplace. And ultimately, my investors, who I brought in, got a 97x return on their investment. And yet it was still accretive to Symantec. So this was zero to do with technology. I mean, literally, I didn't value any part of that business on technology. It was all based on coming up with a business model that worked. So a non-technology, totally disruptive business model that got economies of scale for this and a tax benefit and effectively time-shifted expenses created millions of dollars of value, a 97x return. So what I said to you now, I hope you've got some proof on, which is you don't even have to have a technology breakthrough sometimes to make huge value in the marketplace. You just have to think about what are you trying to do, how can you do it in a disruptive way, and how can that be interesting to your business. Okay, enough of my old legends. Let's bring some real-world fun stuff in. How many of you use Zipcar? Okay, I think you are, lots of you. So I think you are the beginning of a major movement that's going on here, which is just generational. I mean, and I love it, by the way. My daughter's part of this generation. You guys, probably lots of you, don't even think about buying cars. I mean, what a crazy idea. You only use it a little while. Why don't you just share it? So this shared ownership model, which is also penetrating into things like Airbnb, or the sort of communal economy, as I call it, it's a huge movement. And I think it has a penetration of this compared to the potential of this today in all of the products and services we use in the world. So tremendous potential there, whether it's shared offices or it's shared cars or it's shared resources. I think we're going to see massive disruption in this still. Flash sales. How many of you have ever used a flash sale site? Okay. Can you tell me, any of you guys, why did you use it? What was the basis behind it? Just not to pick on you, but since you've used one.
Just a really good discount.
Really good discount.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Did you ever think about, sorry, just bring the mic up so people can hear you.
Sure.
Really good discount. Did you ever think about what was going on in the business model behind that?
It's obviously an investment from these businesses to get you to come after that initial discount. So they're looking for people to come back. But from what I've read of Groupon's business model, it doesn't seem to work for a lot of businesses.
So you've got to be careful with it. Well, we're obviously at Harvard because we're getting smart answers here. So absolutely right. I mean, it's in many instances a lead gen model, actually. You get people to your site. You may lose money on the first thing that you sell them, but you've attracted and bought a customer for effectively the potential to upsell or resell them new things. But it can work very well, or it can fail, like in the case of Groupon, if you don't figure out how to keep a sustainable set of offers that actually makes money for you. So you've got to be very careful with it. Thank you, though. So here's another one that's really fun. If you look at what's going on at Mint, there's actually zero value that you're being asked to pay. I mean, you don't pay for what used to be, Quicken. You get it for free. So again, what's that doing? It's pretty obvious. It's lead gen. Nobody thought that would be successful, but it's actually an extremely successful business. It's been hugely disruptive to Intuit. And in fact, they ended up having to buy it. So again, not a technology shift there, just a business model shift. Now, we're lucky enough to have Acquia with us tonight. And just yesterday, actually, was it yesterday or 2 days ago, we got, that's right, we were all in Vegas, but not just gambling, I should say. We were all there for Amazon's Web Services Conference. But anyway, yeah, Tuesday night. They just became nominated as the fastest growing private company in America in the Fast 500. Second year in a row, because they were here last year talking about it. And again, this is a company that has zero to collect from its core product, Drupal. It's free. So when you get Dennis up here, ask him how did he do that? Because there are some incredibly important things they did in their business model. You talked about Groupon. This is an interesting one because when we first had it up here and I was first giving these seminars, everybody thought Groupon was going to be the biggest thing ever. But there's a big challenge in Groupon's model, and we'll talk about it tonight, which is how do you actually keep it sustainable so that your core value is actually coming to the fore? And it's not clear that Groupon's got that nailed, which is why I've never invested in it. But there are lots of models that are coming out that I think people are quite excited about that are yet unproven that may be very disruptive. For example, changing things from buying to renting, as we were talking about earlier. Why buy the songs if you only want to listen to them and you really don't need to own them? Well, that was obviously the Spotify model. The question is, how does that become sustainable? So in all of this, what I want you to think from all of these models, and there's many others I bet you can think of, is how can you be disruptive? What will you do to change the game? And what I'm going to suggest is, I don't like giving you answers because I don't believe I have any, but I like to give you questions to think about what is it that you could change in your approach to building your business. So here's some sample questions. First of all, do you have a process or a product? Most people think they have a product, but in some instances you don't. So I'm sure we all use Amazon, so I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on that. Do we think Amazon is a product or a service? It's a service, okay? It's pretty obvious. But there's a huge amount that goes into making that service actually feel like a frictionless product. So for example, within it, one-click buy is a huge key differentiator. It was one of the biggest things they changed. Then the next product or service that they introduced, actually there were a whole list, but I'm just picking some out, was obviously Amazon Prime. Huge way to keep customer attention. And it seems extremely attractive to customers, so they found a way to make it a win-win. Again, if you can think about which one are you and how do you distinguish between them, that's a big help. Don't get stuck on the product piece because most people are. Most people feel so early on if they've got something distinct in the way of a technology breakthrough, they've got to productize it and they've got to sell it as product. I wouldn't do that. I'd ask whether your software or services at that point, the way we were talking about Amazon. Then ask questions like, do we really need to be open or proprietary? Again, there's a tendency to say, oh, I invented this, I've got to own it, it's got to be proprietary, I've got to defend it. Maybe. But what if you could actually give it away and get others to contribute to its value and monetize something different, like the content from it? Do we think Yelp is a product?
Service.
Say more. Why?
Well, Yelp wasn't new. There was e-opinions. There was things that predated it that were pretty similar.
Okay, so we think it's a service. What do we think is the essence of it? Do we think it's that just they process your queries to find local services, or what else is there in it? Geofencing. Is there any content in it? Lots of people nodding.
Yeah, that's why you go there. You go there for the content.
Exactly. Yelp would be useless without the content. I mean, it could be brilliantly simple, but if they didn't have the content of what the local merchants were offering and they didn't have the ratings and reviews from people, it'd be absolutely useless. So why don't you just focus on that? Figure out how to get to what I'm now going to describe is the core. the essence of what I want you to do is say, what is it that you have, and this is just a moniker for it, that is really at the core of your value. And if it's content, then monetize the content. Don't get distracted about trying to sell the product or the service or anything else. Figure out what it is that you have that's unique and differentiable that you can actually build on. That's what the core is really all about. So the first question you should have, and I would literally, as a founding group, make sure you do not give up until you've debated this to the nth degree, is what is the core of our thing, of our product or our service or our deliverable that is so exceptional that we think we could defend it against everything else, and everything else around it we'd be willing to give away. And if you look at all the things we've been talking about, like I just picked out Yelp, if they knew that right away, it became very easy, for example, for them to start to think about how do they integrate everything else and give it away. Think about Facebook for a second. Imagine if Facebook had charged you a subscription to get online. Would you have used it? Of course you wouldn't. But they didn't care because they knew right away that the real value was the network. And think about this for a second. If somebody wants to come along and compete with Facebook today, we all know that you could actually recreate Facebook, at least at a technology level, pretty simply. I mean, it's photo sharing and it's connections and things, but you could get a lot of that in open source today. What's the value? The value is if I go onto a brand new network that's got way better features than Facebook, and I can't find anybody else on it, dead. Absolutely useless. The value is they use the network, and they realized that early on. And that's why it was so disruptive, because it rapidly became something that for free we could all get value out of, but they could monetize, obviously, what were the profiles that they were building there for things like advertising and so forth. And that's really the story you're going to hear when you come to see Jim Whitehurst at Red Hat. He realized that the real value around Linux was not the core of Linux being another operating system. It was that in order for it to be broadly used, it needed to be certified for all of the different platforms and supported in all the different ways it might get used. And guess what? That's really valuable. So the key thing is for you to think about what can be your competitive advantage, where are others most vulnerable, and try to make both of those things work in like a double-sided, two-sided sword. You know, it should cut to the core for you, and it should cut across what would be the differentiation against your competitors and give you competitive advantage. So there are many, many examples of this, but I'm going to bring it to life by giving you the obvious one, which is Google. So this actual case example was given last semester, and so you can find the video of this from Don Dodge, who came to give it. But I'm just going to take you through it very quickly. Google's problem when they entered the marketplace was pretty simple. They wanted to continue to attract users, and search was one way, obviously, that they started to win. But in the apps marketplace, they had a huge competitor, actually Microsoft, to state the obvious. So how do you win if you've got Google Docs, which has got no users, and you've got to compete with Microsoft that basically has 90% dominance in the marketplace? Well, you have to go back and say, what's the core for each? And I would argue that if Google, I don't have to argue actually, because they did this. So if they had decided to go and compete head-on feature for feature, well, they would have lost. We all know that. I mean, you know, Microsoft had huge market share. They had decades of development gone into it, billions of profits, literally billions of dollars worth of profits coming out of that division. But now what do? You say, well, hang on a sec. Let's compete on. Let's let Microsoft, for example, own the enterprise market. We'll come in with Google Docs and we'll go after the consumer market. So pick a different segment. And guess what? We'll give it away free. We don't want to compete on the license business. And we'll make it simple so that we're not competing on features. We're actually trying to make it easier to use. And we'll get the 80-20 right, which is actually the key of what people were struggling with, which was that Office was overcomplicated and quite bloated after 10 years. But much more important than that, what was going on? I mentioned Core. Does anybody want to tell me what was going on there? I mean, this is all a product, you know, and market piece. What was actually going on? What are we talking about tonight that was changing there?
You're attracting everyone to their platform, basically. It's more about stickiness to Google versus Microsoft.
Absolutely right. They were attracting people to their platform, and they were giving away software to do it. And why could they afford to do that? What were they going to monetize?
The users themselves by advertising.
Absolutely. That is the key differentiator that was going on here. What they were really doing was they were saying, look, forget the software. We don't care about that. To this gentleman's point, we're attracting our users here with some more value, because the more users we get, the more profiles we get, the more people we can advertise to. So we don't care about the money on the apps. We want to give it away. In fact, as far and wide as it can get used, so much the better. So guess what? They did exactly what we were talking about. They created an innovator's dilemma. Microsoft could not follow that because they could not afford to give $3.8 billion worth of profit away that year. That's what it would cost them, just to be extremely clear, to have made their Office suite free. They had hundreds of people working on it. They had thousands of businesses that were just reliant on it. So it was not going to be given away free, because even the support costs alone would have killed them, even if they could have just given up the revenue. So what was so disruptive here was not the technology, it was the business model. And in fact, if you hear Microsoft in their years of trying to compete with us, I can tell you, I know a board member who should remain nameless, but he was on a board with us, who was on the Microsoft board, who was sitting there watching their stock as a dial tone throughout this period, because it didn't matter what they added in the way of features. They were just competing on a different level. And in fact, the more features they added, the more bloat they had. And they redesigned Office, and they came up with Clippy, the little Office character, which drove everybody crazy. And then the next thing they did, they changed the toolbars, and everybody went crazy because now they had to relearn the thing. And what was going on here was this like complete mismatch. So this is the kind of disruption we want you to come up with. And so there's more about this in the case. You can watch the video online. The second one I find really interesting is in the mobile world, because this is going on right now. And it's not played out yet. So I won't go into this in too much detail, except to say that if you stop and think about this, Apple and Google are actually selling apparently the same product, iPhones versus Android phones, except they're selling it in very different ways. Google is giving away, again, the operating system in Android. They've open sourced it. And there's some good and bad going on with that. Fragmentation being the bad, the good being they've got lots of people adopting it. But again, if you think about what they want users. They don't really care about that revenue coming out of the operating system. Apple, by contrast, has got a very deep set of things that it's monetizing. It's not clear to any of us who are on the outside which one of those is really going to work for them. They pretty much make no money out of their content. The apps is an interesting business for them, but again, they take 30% of the revenue, not 70%. So again, it's attracting apps to drive their platform. And in the end, they've probably got an end-to-end play here, which is actually open for disruptive. So who is winning and why is actually a question. And I'll tell you one thing, I don't think it's got anything to do with technology at the end of the day as to who wins this. There's no question in my mind that Apple, for me, is a better experience. I've tried Android. But there are lots of people who completely disagree with me. But it's not the point. I think what will win out here is somebody's business model is going to be much more appealing and much more successful. So all I'll simply say here is Google is clearly playing this again to disrupt the market leader, is changing the game, and they're doing it in a pretty interesting way. For example, the way Apple disrupted the carriers was to provide an end-to-end solution, which wasn't something that the carriers had wanted at that point in time. But then now Google's coming along and saying, yeah, but we can actually take a lot of the cost out of that and provide a way for you to leverage this ecosystem more effectively without being proprietary. So it's going to be very interesting to watch. The bottom line is, if you haven't already figured it out, business models really matter. 3 big companies that are wrestling today are all wrestling around business models more than they're wrestling around technology, or at least as much. Okay, so now we finally hopefully have your attention. How do we create value? Let's start with the first component of this. And I'm going to introduce my case example here of Acquia. Well, first of all, there are many ways to create value. But for tonight's case example, I'm going to give you one startup secret. You can co-create value and take a lot of your costs out. So for example, in the software business, an easy way to think about this is by being open and extensible, even if you're not going to go open source. I highly recommend that you find a way to build on yourself. In other words, make sure that your platform or your core value, as we've talked about it, is something that you yourself use to build on top of. So build your product on itself. And in this world of cloud services, for example, do things like open up your APIs. The single biggest growth in my cloud survey, which is a big survey among 60 collaborators that, again, you can find details on my site, that we saw in the last 3 months is a conversation around how important it is to have open APIs so your products can get integrated. But even at the beginning of developing, if you create open APIs for your own developers internally to build on top of your product, then you not only have an internal customer, but you're also going to open up the beginning of an ecosystem potentially for others externally to do that. So it's a very exciting way to start thinking about things. So for software, that's a no-brainer startup secret that I would almost invariably recommend to companies. It's not always possible. And then the second one to set Acquia up is, of course, open source. Get leverage through the community and make the customer the product manager. Allow them to scratch their own itch. So what better way to introduce this than to have Dennis here, our new CFO at Acquia. Dennis, come on up and tell us a little bit about Acquia and how do you guys make money out of the open source world?
I'm good, I'm Mike. Thanks. Thanks, Michael. Hi everyone, I'm Dennis Morgan. I am the CFO of Acquia. Acquia is based in Burlington, just outside the city. And we leverage Drupal as an open source platform. Who here knows what Drupal is? A few people. So who here knows what Linux is? Many more Linux. Which do you think is the bigger open source project? Linux. Drupal is the largest open source platform in the world. Drupal is an open source platform for web content management. Basically, it's a programming system for running websites, some of which you may have heard of before. So we built a business model around an open source software platform. And we'll get to how we do it, but the key benefit of building around open source is the following. There are 1,000 people who contributed to Drupal 7. Drupal 8 is now in release. Drupal 8 has 2,000 people contributing to it. Overall, in active development, we have 28,000 people working on Drupal. At Acquia today, we have, I think, 50 engineers. And that drives innovation. The community, people like this who are all Drupal engineers, Drupal developers, are able to create a product. Open source, the collaboration, the community leads to a product innovation that you cannot get with a 400-person organization that has 50 engineers in it. And that's the benefit of working on an open source product. The challenge that creates, though, is how do we build a business model around it? We took Drupal and we enable organizations to run Drupal at industrial strength. We do this, but we provide a cloud platform for them to, a platform for them to run the website. We provide developer tools. We provide software that you can add on to run on your website. We provide professional services such as training. We provide insights into what's going on your website, etc. The result of which is if you're running a Drupal website, if you're a big organization running a Drupal website, that website runs much, much better on Acquia than it does on any other platform that you can run. So again, industrial strength support for Drupal is the business model we created, and we've now built that. I think I'm jumping ahead now.
No, it's
So,
okay. That's good. So what are some of the largest customers we have, just to give people a sense? I mean, why do people care about service and support?
For Drupal, so I'll give you a great example. Any New Yorkers in here? Yeah, so we moved the New York MTA, that's the New York Transit Authority. We moved the New York MTA's website onto Drupal as it turned out, a matter of weeks before Superstorm Sandy hit last year. And when everything went down in New York City, we kept the MTA website running all through the storm and its aftermath. So all of us who are in New York trying to figure out how to get to work, that website continued to run and tell people what they needed about their commute. Warner Music, this is an interesting case. So the music business has a very interesting challenge with websites because the music industry, Warner Music has hundreds and hundreds of artists with a website for each artist. And how do they manage the governance, just the control of all those different websites? And yet each artist wants to create custom cool websites for their own, that reflects who they are as an artist. By using Drupal and by hosting it on Acquia, we enable Warner Music to take 300 artist websites, run it on one infrastructure, and yet each of those artists gets the creative freedom that they're looking for. So there's a couple of examples of what we do.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So what you can hear is that the core value turned out to not be the software. There's a ton of things that are needed to support the infrastructure of running a global website, whether it's a Warner Music or a GE.com, which is another customer. And it's critical for them that their websites are up all the time, that their customers see the face of their business as being highly scalable, that they don't crash, and that they get sub-millisecond response times for things like how do they find a train or a product or whatever it might be. So there's real value in that. And the point about this is how we actually create, deliver, and harness value in open source is very different to how you do it in a traditional business. And in fact, we're now going to talk about the second part of that, which is the delivering and harnessing of value. And I'm going to introduce the first of two concepts, which I talk about: multipliers. Multipliers are things that increase the revenue around your core. So once you've identified what your core is, if it's content or it's data or it's products or whatever it is, the idea of the multiplier is it's something that will help you increase your revenue, increase your reach out to your customers, or increase your coverage of your product. And if you think about some of the examples we talked about, with things like Google, they gave it away in order to increase reach. They basically said, why pay for something that you can get for free if all we're interested in is capturing more customers? Then we'll do that. We'll use that as a multiplier. But that's the sort of, if you like, the one-hand side of this thing. The other side of it is what you were hearing from Dennis, which is there's what I call levers, which are things that reduce time or reduce costs or reduce resources to delivering your product or service. And those might be things that are more interesting in terms of, for example, how do you build your product, as I said, with co-creation or with a community like Drupal has. And if you can figure out how to do that, you can have, instead of thousands of engineers, you can have tens of engineers. And just to be very specific about it, Microsoft had, for example, or has, I think, a few hundred engineers on SharePoint, which is today a huge content management platform. But how on earth could they possibly compete with nearly 1 million people who are basically constantly innovating around the Drupal platform? They're never going to compete. They'll never even understand the sets of things that are needed at the scale or reach that Drupal has. They just can't compete. And the reason that, therefore, it's such a lever for Acquia is that that community continues to reduce the cost of meeting all the needs that are out there, while at the same time it's also increasing the reach of people who are trying it and developing it. And at the core of it, what Acquia has created is a business model where they're monetizing, obviously, what the value is the customer needs for things like security and support and scalability and reliability, et cetera, et cetera. So the secret here is very simple. You want to find ways that your multiplier can do things like in sales and marketing, bring out tiered pricing, enable you to do things like freemium to reach new customers easier, get yourself engaged with channel partners, and then this is now their asterisk for a reason. There are a whole bunch of things you can do in your product design, which is in that products to companies session that's on my website. And again, people who don't know it, it's up on the top right-hand side if you want that URL, mjskolk.com. So there are whole sets of things you can do in your product design that will actually give you a multiplier in terms of reaching your marketplace and getting out to increase your value at the front end. And then on the other side of things, you want to be looking for levers in sales and marketing too. And they're things like, how can you use the web instead of sending out people on the road? And in fact, Max is going to talk about this from Formlabs. But so Max, I know from day one, without even saying what Formlabs does, you decided that you didn't want to send salespeople on the road. You probably didn't think about it as a lever per se, but why did you think about it? Why did you decide you didn't want salespeople?
So, I think it was really a holistic part of building a product that was lower cost and easier to use, and so the kind of the purchasing process and the way the customer interacted with us should also reflect that. And so we didn't want people having to call up and wait to schedule a meeting with a salesperson and get a pitch and get a quote. You should be able to buy it direct through the web and have everything you need there, ready for you to make the purchasing decision.
Great. So what was also going on with Max's example is not only was he making it easier for customers to reach him, but he was making it easier for him to support them. So by thinking early on about how could he use the web, and you should do the same thing, think about how you can use inside or inbound marketing, inside sales or inbound marketing, or viral techniques, for example. You can dramatically take the cost down of how you get your product to market. And I would say the other thing that people typically forget is how do you use your levers to, for example, take out the cost of the back end things like supporting your product. And there are some fantastic things you can do today that never even existed a few years ago, like, for example, crowdsourcing support or crowdsourcing testing. There's a fantastic company, it's a case example on my site called UTest, that has come up with a way to test, for example, all mobile products in a completely crowdsourced fashion. If you just think about this for a second, how would you possibly replicate all the different phones and different operating systems and all the different environments and networks and carriers and locations in the world in your own lab? Incredibly expensive, right? It'd just be way too difficult to do. Yet that's what people used to do until UTest came along and said, no, we'll crowdsource that. we'll sort of outsource it to people in the crowd and enable that to be tested by providing a platform that reaches it. Brilliant business model, and by the way, highly valuable and differentiated as a result of it. So 2 takeaways for tonight are around your core, figure out how can you get multipliers and how can you get levers. And if you've got your core right, what you'll find is this: you can get them working together. And the key is to get strategies and multipliers that around your core create a distinction in your business model. When you do that, you're into a good spot. So again, to bring it back to life, I'm going to ask Dennis to jump up and share with you just how does this really work when you get down to the grassroots at Acquia.
Yeah, so how do you make money on free and open source software? So as we talked about, we create products around the core of Drupal, and we use that free and open source as a multiplier and lever in R&D, sales, and marketing. And it's really the community that does this for us. So the community, those 28,000 developers that we talked about, are constantly innovating the product that is Drupal. They're constantly making it better, again, in a scale that we cannot replicate as one organization. More importantly, they provide levers, and the levers happen in the sales model as well as in the development model. So a great example of a lever is a lot of our clients we get are just inbound requests. So on Tuesday, as Michael and I mentioned, I had the chance to speak at the AWS Partner Conference. Partners are all of the consulting shops and people like that who develop for customers, for their clients who are using AWS to run their websites. As a result of that, we had numerous people come up to our booth there at AWS afterwards and say, I have a client who's running Drupal and we need help, please help us, right? There's no better a sales call, a sales lead that you can get than that. So Drupal is the sales lead. We have GE as a client. We have a GE as a client because there was a guy working in GE who was a Drupalist. He was a Drupal developer, and they needed a quick website, so he built a quick website in Drupal, and the folks in GE are like, wow, that was really easy. If I called IT to get that done, it would take 2 months. Let's do more of that. And then again, as I talked about earlier, there's still reluctance for a big company like GE to fully adopt open source without having anyone to pick up the phone and be able to call when they've got issues. So that's where Acquia comes in. Acquia provides that industrial strength support for something that people are using already. Those are the multipliers and the levers. The multipliers and levers in the development and the sales leads that it gives you. As a result, we're now, as Michael just mentioned, we were just named the second fastest growing company in all of America over the last 4 or 5 years. I forget which one it is. And this is on a real scale. You know, we don't really disclose our numbers, but we're doing north of $50 million in revenue. We've grown 250% compound annual growth rate over the last 3 years. We have almost 4,000 customers, again, over 400 employees. Oh, and another thing that's great about it, we're global. So Drupal is used in 238 different countries, something like that. I'm not even sure how many countries there are, but it seems like if there's a country, it has a Drupal website in it. So when we figure out, one of the great challenges you'll have as a growing company is what countries do I know I need to go international, but where? Well, it's really easy for us. We look for where is there heavy Drupal usage, and then we go and put people and find the business right in those countries. It's a very, it's a flywheel business where Drupal reinforces what we do, but it works the other way. We have a number of our core values at Acquia. One of our core values is committed to awesomeness, and committed to awesomeness is important because in order to get you to pay us to use something for free, what we do has to be awesome. So committed to awesomeness, we try to envelope in everything that we do. And another one is give back more. Give back more means lots of things. It means charity, of course. That's why I have the crazy mustache. But it also, by us providing this industrial strength support for Drupal, it helps further spread Drupal as well. It gets companies like GE that would normally not use an open source platform for a production website for GE to use that. So again, that's the reinforcing model that comes from Acquia and Drupal. And here it is sort of in a nice graphic. So 70% of the prospects we have in our business have already selected Drupal to build their websites. They come in, and then it goes from there. Another part of the flywheel is it usually starts where they put one or two, a small number of websites on our platform, on Acquia. And then they realize how well this works, how much success they have with not only just Drupal, but with Acquia supporting Drupal. They put more and more of their websites on that, and all of a sudden, that's what's called a land and expand strategy. Land in with a couple websites, an initial amount of support, show how good this is. Now, and today, companies have more and more websites. Large pharmaceutical type companies have literally thousands of websites. So if you can penetrate that and get just a handful of them initially on your platform, show how valuable they are, pretty soon you start expanding into everything that they're doing, not only just on the computer web, but Drupal flows across mobile and social, et cetera. And that's how the model all comes together.
Great. So what you can see from this is a real-world example of a company that's figured out how to use its core of a web platform that people can get access to easily and upsell all the value-added products and services. And then doing what they do best, use their core values. Those of you who are here, by the way, for the culture session, you can hear Dennis is the CFO, and here he is talking about their core values of committed to awesomeness and give back more. In the culture, driving the business model, which is what we talked about there. And that's how they're getting, for example, the community to actually engage them. And then, by the way, the customers are actually giving back what they developed too. So you may not realize it, but a lot of our government runs on Drupal, whitehouse.gov and a bunch of other stuff. Fortunately, not any of the healthcare initiatives, I should be quick to point out, although we'd like to fix that problem. But we're actually getting the government to contribute back their open source code too, because when they find things that they can deliver that's valuable to other people, everybody wins. So it's really a virtuous circle that occurs when you get your multipliers and levers right. So I would say this is a great example of something that you can think about, obviously in your context, ways that you might create a core and then multipliers and levers around. And hopefully you got a sense of that from tonight. Now I try to add always some new sections, and one of the questions I get asked a lot is, how do small companies get big? It's an easy question, but it's a hard one to answer. And one of my key startup secrets is through strategic partnerships. And so we've often glossed over this. I'm going to cover it in a little bit of detail tonight. It turns out that if you can stand on the shoulders of giants as a startup, you can probably figure out how to get big quicker. And so let's talk about this a little bit. The most obvious one that I see a lot is what I call a whole product strategic partnership. That is to say, you very rarely as a startup have an entire end-to-end solution or a whole product. For those of you who were here the first year, we had Jeffrey Moore of Crossing the Chasm fame, who talk about and defined a lot of the whole product concept, come in and talk about this. So you can find that out again on the website. But the real essence of it is this. If you don't have a whole solution end-to-end, then figure out who does and figure out how you could partner with them to insert yourself in their value chain so that is a win-win for you both to go to market together. And there are many ways that I could give this as an example, but I'll tell you my own story. And it was in the analytics space. Now, big data is hot today, but if you look at big data, what you'll see is in almost every case, it's like an iceberg. What you see at the top, that little piece of the iceberg that's sticking out, that's the analytics or the dashboard that may measure, for example, customers and click-through and all that kind of stuff. That is actually supported by a massive iceberg of how do you collect the data, how do you transform it so that it's actually normalized, so it can actually be analyzed, how do you make sure that it's stored in the way that can be reaccessed or reported on, etc. And those kinds of things actually have a lot of different partners. They have storage partners, they have database partners, they even have application server partners, they have even logon authentication partners. They have many, many different pieces before you can actually get to, say, the deliverable at the top of your analytics application. So in this example, if you are the guy who's delivering, say, the dashboard at the top, you're not going to go and try to build all that other stuff. That would be insane, even though it's absolutely critical for you to have it. So why wouldn't you go and partner with the other players that have that? Because if you enable their storage, for example, or their database, or their application services to finally be shown in a really dramatic way that shows value, they're going to love you. They're going to see that you pull their products through. Now, I'll give you one example from my current portfolio, which is a company called Unidesk. They pull through 10 times the amount of hardware for Dell than software they sell. Do you think Dell likes them? Sure they do. They like them a lot. They like them so much they invested. And in fact, that model is so successful that we have leads coming from Dell that literally are one in 3 of them are turning into customers. So Dell is qualifying, doing all the hard work and bringing us the leads because they know that whenever we sell, they're going to get that huge multiple on our software for pulling all the hardware, storage, and everything else that Dell sells. Now, that's how small companies get big. And it's easy to say, but let's just look at it in the multiplier and levers model and remind us what's going on here. What's going on here is we're managing to increase our revenue through a much fuller solution. We'll get more value when we can deliver an end-to-end product. We're increasing our reach through somebody else's sales and channel because they're going to take us to market through their channels or, for example, incent their sales force. And that's, by the way, a very key detail we'll come to in a minute is how you do that. And of course, if you're a small company, what do you think is a better business card to walk in with? Unidesk, who probably none of you have ever heard of, or Dell, which I guess a lot of you have heard of? Easy, right? Dell. Even though Dell might be your top choice here in this room at the moment for your personal computer, I can tell you in the enterprise, they count. So it's obvious, but these things are all multipliers in your business model. And they're all things that you can do by establishing something like a whole product strategic partnership. Now let's talk about the levers. Does it reduce time to market? Of course it does. If they're producing us sales leads and we're not having to go do all that marketing, it's tremendously powerful at reducing our costs. And in an incredibly important way, by the way, by us not having to develop all of that end-to-end solution, we're also taking out a lot of our development costs. Now today, by the way, Dell might not be the best example, having just come from Amazon's Web Services Summit. 9,000 people there producing all sorts of cloud services. This model probably would look like a series of cloud services that you mashed up as an application, where you were one piece of it, and all of those other people providing it could be parts of your strategic partnership. But the point I'm making here is this. You, in the end, want some kind of a symbiotic multiplier and lever relationship, a win-win, where your product, your distribution, and anything else effectively gives you something of a 1 + 1 is greater than 2, where your partner sees that they're going to get something out of this. You're dragging, for example, products or services for them, and vice versa is true. And in many instances, by the way, it can create a strategic exit. It can create an opportunity, if you're not successful in your own right, to get an outcome. And if you look at, for example, in my industry, you're 6 or 7 times more likely to get acquired than you are to go public. I'm just talking from an investor's perspective. So doing this early and figuring it out sets you up for at least a plan B if you can't get a plan A. So just to summarize on this, an ideal win-win, you'll get a complete product, you'll figure out how to get the multipliers out of things like channels to reach your target customer, and what they'll get is competitive advantage by being able to include you in a solution. And they'll typically get a higher ARPU by being able to include you, as I mentioned in the Dell example. And in the end, most big companies look at small companies and say the real reason they want to work with you is because they get time to market advantage. Because usually small companies are more innovative than big companies, and they move faster. That's their advantage. And so that's why they'll look at you. But one other secret I should just put on here very, very openly next time, actually, is that never approach a strategic partner with what you want. Approach it with this right-hand column. Tell them what you're going to give them. Tell them all the reasons why they should deal with you. Of course, you know what's on the left-hand side. That's your job. But make sure that you approach them and say, here are the 5 reasons you should work with me, and these are the things that you're going to get and why it's a no-brainer for you to do it. If it's a why wouldn't you proposition, you're going to open the conversation the right way. Most startups go in there and say, well, how could you sell my stuff? It's like, that's not going to be a good opening line. But you flip it around and say, hey, look, I know I can sell 10 times as more hardware and software for you by inserting my solution as part of your deliverable. They're going to pay attention. And the devil is in the details. So some of the details you should consider are things like who is actually incented to sell this. Getting, for example, somebody's sales force to actually be commissioned on your product is more important than figuring out how to make your brochure look better between the two of you. What you put online together is not as important as the fact that somebody is actually getting their commission retired when they sell your product. That makes a difference. That's how salespeople are coin operated. And then things like who's actually supporting it. Even if they're reselling it, that's great. But if you're taking all the support costs, that's not so smart. So think about, for example, who handles first and second line support. And then if you're going to OEM it, which is a typical thing that startups think that is really clever, oh, I can get OEM rights to my product so it's distributed all over the place. And then you stop and think about that for a second and say, well, that's useless to me if I can't upsell on it. So if you've given away your product very cheaply, because OEMs will typically give you cents on the dollar, that works great if you have something of incremental value to sell on top of it. And so that's why upsell becomes so important. And for those of you who are interested in the products to companies strategy session, we talk about this in an area I call Russian doll packaging, which is how you package your products in ways to handle things like OEMs. So go search for that on my site and you'll find a whole article on it. Okay, I'm not Jobs, but I love one more thing. This is a famous sort of question that I get at the iLab a lot, which is, okay, I'm in the early stages of my product. How do I design it for success? Well, there's a lot you can do to design your product for success. So as I mentioned, that case and that whole workshop will be on in the spring. But the first thing I'd say for people who are trying to deal with this is really think hard about the user experience, the supportability, how you're going to maintain it, how you'll update it, how will you create upgrades, how will you enable other people to resell it. Just a simple example, but if you don't think about how somebody as a third party can actually sell your product for you and deliver it on your behalf without you having to be anywhere near it, so it's touch-free as it will, you're not going to be able to do things like OEM deals. So you've got to think about those things as part of your product design. And as I said, we'll cover that next semester for those who want to jump in on it. Okay, want to bring this to life by just talking about a quick example here, and that is, of course, to complete our case study, Acquia and Drupal. And one of the concepts you'll find is what I call slippery products. And Drupal is simple, low to no initial cost. It's free. It installs incredibly easy. You can just download and install it. It proves very, very quickly. You heard an example of that at GE, but basically it's grassroots. It plays well with others. It actually integrates with pretty much everything on the web. That's one of its great assets. It, for example, allows you to integrate with things like Amazon Commerce on one extreme, or PayPal payments on another extreme, or Salesforce, or when something new like Pinterest comes out, somebody develops a module for it, it integrates with Pinterest. It's incredibly easy to use. It's web-based. The ROI is very obvious, which is basically it's free. You only have to pay for it when you're actually getting value from it. And your customers end up basically becoming your marketeers of the thing, because they themselves end up extending it and building in their own value to it. So when you get to look at what I call slippery products, you'll see that Drupal is a very good example of it. Now the Russian doll thing, just because of time today, I'm going to really quickly go through. It's just a way of packaging and pricing and distributing your software so that you can do what I love to call addiction before adoption. And what I encourage you to do when you think about your products is exactly this. Don't get hung up on having your business model perfect day one, so long as you know you're headed towards a good place. If you can get your customers addicted to your product or your service early on, which has been, frankly, the way most web services have taken off. Think about everything from, for example, the way Instagram has taken off to the way we were talking about Uber, for those of you who were at the symposium, took off. It became addictive before people, really had to figure out what was going on. And the trick is to do that in a packaging form that enables what you just heard from Dennis, which is this land and expand. So you can hear we didn't actually have to acquire any of the first customers for Drupal. 70% of our leads are coming from people who are just downloading the stuff and trying it. And when they're getting value out of it, then they realize, oh, we need somebody to support it. So we onboard them. We do that very inexpensively. And then once they start to deploy it broadly, then we upsell them new services, things like security services or search, for example, which is needed by every website. And that's what's helped an incredible business model that you wouldn't necessarily hear people expose, but I'm exposing it to you, so forgive me, Dennis. We're not public yet, so that's okay. We've had our lifetime value of our customers going up and to the right since day one. So just look at these numbers without me giving them in detail. It's more than tripling in value over the last few years. So we're seeing ways to continue to sell more and more value, and that's what drives the ultimate thing that I'm talking to you about here, which is how your business model builds a sustainable and valuable business. You find ways to continuously deliver more and more value. So again, it's sometimes hard for people to absorb all of these concepts. And those of you who've been at my workshops before know that I often say I'm a self-professed terrible learner, so I create acronyms for everything. So what makes for a great business model for me is RSVP, that people want to respond to it. It should be repeatable. That is to say, you don't have to reinvent your business model for every customer. It should be scalable. with leverage. In other words, we should find ways in which you could go from 0 to 1 million users without changing it. And indeed, every time you add a user, you're getting leverage from it, which is this notion of a virtuous circle. It should be valuable, which is the way we've been describing some of these models, how you add value with things like your multipliers. And it should be predictable. And that's this notion of what I mentioned to you when I was describing what happened at Symantec. When we created the subscription model and we got that predictable monthly service because of people wanting to pay for their viruses, it became way more valuable because we knew what our revenue was going to be. The service of, the challenge of old style sales models where you have to go out and literally close the quarter on the 24th hour of the 31st day of the end of the quarter is horrendous. Trust me, I've lived that too. And it's very unpredictable and it causes all sorts of challenges, and you've seen companies lose billions of dollars overnight because they missed their quarters when that stuff is going on. Whereas you can get away from that by setting your business model out in this way. And ultimately, and I left it out separately because you know you have a good business model when you're headed towards profitability. But if you look at the number of companies that have gone public that are worth over $1 billion today, there are a large number of them are not profitable today. And people are okay with that because what they're doing is they're buying market share because people understand their business model is ultimately at any time easily switch to being profitable if they slow their growth. If they, for example, want to stop investing so much in acquiring new markets or new customers. So this is why business model is so important. When you've got an RSVP type strategy and you know it's going to lead to profitability, people will trust you and continue to enable you to invest and to build what might be, for example, a leading position. So hopefully we'll help all of you get there. And again, I want to bring this to life by now inviting Max up to come and give a real-world example of a company that's at ground zero building its business model. So Max, come tell us about Formlabs, and thank you for joining us.
So I'll just give you a quick overview about Formlabs, and then I think we'll jump into a little discussion about the business model. But basically, Formlabs is trying to make 3D printing like 2D printing. So today, you have a 2D printer on your desktop at your office. Anytime you want to see something on paper that you're working on to document a photo or anything like that, you press print. You don't worry about the cost and you don't worry about the process. So this is actually the printer in our office. We have to label it because it gets confusing sometimes. But so this is the vision of a 3D printer on every desktop. That's the Form 1, our product. So 3D printing has been around for a while, and there's a variety of different processes, but for the most part, they're big machines that haven't really seen their full potential because they're not as available as they could be. So there's a bunch of different applications. Product design is probably the biggest one, prototyping products for product design. Architecture, producing models for architects, art, medicine, the human body. Every human body is different, so there's a great need for custom parts there. In education. So the problem we're trying to address, the market, is that there's 10 million 3D CAD users right now across mechanical CAD, architectural CAD, things like that, but only something like 30,000 installed professional 3D printers. And so we're not talking about a mass consumer product at the moment. We're talking about getting 3D printers to everybody who's designing something in 3D. So how do we do that? With a end-to-end user experience. And so we built the machine, the Form 1, but we also build the software that runs it, kind of the printer driver, as well as the materials that you use in it, which is a predictable consumables revenue. And so all that together, we have a business model where we're selling this product as what we call a prosumer product, whereas the earlier generation of machines are large $10,000 to $100,000 machines that involve salesmen coming to your office and bringing the machine for a demo and explaining the ROI and TCO and et cetera of this thing and how it's going to help your business. This is now something that you can buy through the web, price point around $3,000. And the end user, the engineer or designer who's actually going to be using it is now making the decision, maybe with a quick email approval from their boss. And so it's a completely different sales process. we sell the machine. We also sell the consumables that run the machine, and so there's kind of there's that initial part of the revenue as well as the repeatable part.
Would just sit and chat for a moment, because this is a very interesting stage he's at, and probably everybody's sort of asked him these questions many times along the way. But so, where are you in terms of designing your business model? What is the sort of set of questions you've got that's holding you up at this point?
So we're shipping products now. We've been shipping for 5 or 6 months, but we're still kind of at the early stage where we're ramping up production, and right now we're actually back ordered for many months. So, the whole question of how we will really sell it, we haven't really gotten to the point where we have to answer that yet, because people buy more of them than we can make. And so I think the real questions for us right now are, some of our competitors have already kind of proved the direct through the web model, at least in the US, but how does that apply internationally? Can we, do we really have the same marketing clout in the rest of the world? And can, even in the US, can we really reach all of the potential users through this very simple model?
So you mentioned that you're using the web as a way to do low-cost selling. Are there any partners that you could get as channels to market that might take you internationally, that would expand your reach as a multiplier there?
Yeah, so because this is kind of this new class of product, people are still figuring out how to distribute this. Previously, those bigger machines were distributed by very niche distributors who either only did 3D printers or did 3D printers and maybe CAD software, and they're kind of dedicated, small, very expensive distributors. And so now, we're looking at potentially consumer electronics type channels, but also sort of figuring out what it means for us.
So for Max, one of the interesting things about where he's at is he can find a partner, for example. We've talked about channels here, but imagine if he could find a strategic partner who needs a 3D printer to sell all of the other things that go along with it. That would be a huge multiplier and a win-win. Are there such partners out there?
Yeah, so there are some vertical applications that would make a lot of sense in that model. So there's some things people have been discussing are like doing custom earbuds for, as a mass consumer product. And so if you had somebody who's trying to build installations, there's a couple of people out there trying to do this now. So trying to build thousands of installations where each one has a 3D printer to deliver this. There's some angles like that where if you get that right, that's kind of instant multiplier. Education in some ways is like that, and there are some potential partners to work with there where once you've got a kind of proven curriculum and shown that it works in the classroom, then it becomes very easy to sell to many schools.
Now here's a tough question, which I know you've been asked before, which is your core value in the end going to be the actual printer itself, or the software that's used to design the parts, or is it going to be even the consumables? Do you know yet, and how do you think that's going to shake out?
I mean, right now we really invest kind of evenly across all three, and them working together really is the value. I think longer term, I don't know. It's hard to say, but we're gonna work on all of them, and we understand there's this pressure that the hardware, there's a lot more price competition there. But at this point, I think we're still several years away before these things are made cheaply in China, and there's no margin left in them. So we'll worry about that problem in a couple of years.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I think one of the things you're going to hear as the Formlabs story evolves is that each one of those pieces is going to be a challenge for Max to try to figure out, where is the core differentiation? There are, companies that today only make their money in the sort of razor and blade strategy on the consumables, like the blades. And then there are companies that obviously only make their money in the software, for example, that designs it. So I'm sure there's some interesting partnerships, and we'll look forward to having you back as they evolve. But thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to introduce my next guest now. So Jason is our not-for-profit, come on up, Jason, story for tonight, because I'm always asked, what do we do to create business models in the not-for-profit world? So Jason, welcome, and good to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I want to talk today about my company, Diagnostics for All. What we're trying to do is to disrupt the way healthcare is delivered, both in the developing world as well as the developed world. Our emphasis is on serving the needs of those in the developing world through diagnostics, and how do we obtain medical information on a fundamentally low-cost platform. So we were founded in 2007. We're a registered not-for-profit. We're located just across the river. We have about 18 full-time employees, and most of those are scientists and engineers working with us, and we've raised $14 million to date. So our technology platform is based on paper, and so this is technology that was developed here at Harvard in the Whitesides lab in the Department of Chemistry. And the basic idea here is can I take one of the cheapest materials possible, which is paper, and can I pattern channels into that and use those channels to manipulate fluids and make a whole new generation of diagnostics across the spectrum from simple clinical chemistry assays to nucleic acid assays on a fundamentally inexpensive platform. So this is our current pipeline of funded programs. A good amount of this funding comes from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Our liver function test, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides, is our lead product, and that is in the early stages of clinical validation as we eye regulatory approval for that. We see tremendous opportunities in the field of agriculture and have some funding to work on tests for aflatoxin and bovine pregnancy. In addition to that, we have funding from the Department of Defense for a potential biothreat agent, brucellosis, and also looking at immunity status, so being able to monitor whether or not a child has been vaccinated in the developing world. So our business model, our founders, George Whitesides, recognized that academics are historically terrible at product development. And there needs to exist an organization that sits in between the innovators and the commercial partners. And that's what we were formed to be, to take innovative ideas and concepts and tools and build products that address specific needs in the developing world. And then our job is to hand those off. And we can hand those off to commercial partners in country, so diagnostic manufacturers in Africa. But also we recognizing that there's money to be made with simple, easy-to-use technology here in the developed world. So we also can hand off and sub-license technology to for-profit companies and generate revenue streams. And so that's our goal. So I think our multiplier would be fundraising, and our lever is getting those products out the door and creating customers that are actually using them. You think about charities. You don't want to donate to the Red Cross for relief efforts from the typhoon if you don't think they're going to be able to do anything with your money. So you need to be able to have products out there, and that in turn creates more fundraising opportunities. So when we talk about not-for-profit fundraising, it's a very, very unusual model. So venture capital, it doesn't exactly have a place here because there's no return on the investment. But there are other opportunities because you're focusing on the developing world that come up. One of them is charitable donation. There's not a lot of for-profit companies that can collect charitable funds. Another is grants. And so I would argue that we would not be able to have generated the grant revenue that we have from the Gates Foundation if we were not exclusively focused on the developing world. And so that opens up different pools of cash. And there's pros and cons to each of these. One of the problems with grants is that it can be non-discretionary. So there's things that certain organizations don't want you to spend money on, like IP portfolio management, or in some cases even rent. So that brings us to the second source of charitable donation. We're just getting started on this. We've raised about $1.5 million in charitable donation. Most of that is from high net worth individuals. The really great thing about that is that it's discretionary, and it allows you to fund your own projects. That you've had this idea, you know it will work, you know it will have a huge impact, but you don't feel like waiting a year to go through the grant process. So that allows you flexibility there. The con, it can be slow. It can be, these require established relationships built up over years with high net worth individuals, or in the case of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, like Wikipedia raised $20 million in 2012, but they did it by annoying millions of people when they went to Wikipedia to donate $10. So it requires that constant effort. And then finally, strategic strategic partnerships, and I'll talk about one in a couple of slides, but this is tremendously helpful for us and a key part of our business model. Because it can provide resources. So if we can partner with a large diagnostics company, for example, or a large pharma company, we get access to all of their FDA regulatory guidance. There's also the potential, as I mentioned, for revenue generation if it's for a for-profit application. Cons to that, you might have to answer to your partner. You might have a direction you want to take the test, and they want to take it in a different direction. So it can be potentially distracting from the mission. But overall, we were formed as a not-for-profit to maintain the focus on the developing world. So can such a model work? I just wanted to quickly highlight to an organization that we've worked with called PATH. They're located in Seattle. And this is a not-for-profit organization with a $305 million annual operating budget. And that's mostly raised through grants, contracts, and charitable funds from the Gates Foundation and from USAID. So this model can work, and they're exclusively focused on technology and product development for the developing world. 1,200 employees in 22 countries, and they have 55 success stories of products that they can step away from it. So they create the product, they find a commercial manufacturer that sells the product in the developing world, and they can go off. All of PATH could collapse, and that product cycle still maintains, and that's exactly what we want to do with our tests. The major difference between us and PATH is they don't maintain an extensive IP portfolio, and we do. And we see this not just as a third revenue stream, not just from grants or charitable funds, but being able to sub-license, just like any other biotech company would. And that's exactly what we're doing with this product, which is our lead product, the liver function test. So this is a small paper-based test. I should have brought one with me. It cost about 10 cents for us to make this. And basically, the problem this is solving is it's giving you, from a single finger stick drop of blood, a measurement of your liver enzyme, so the status of your liver. We designed this product as a companion diagnostic for people in the developing world on HIV medications. Basically, you add a drop of blood, it filters through these patterned paper layers, gives you a color readout. You can either compare that visually to a color guide, or we've also developed a mobile reader for this that uses a phone to interpret the color. So you can see this is a mobile app. We're hovering this over the paper test here. In this case, it's a low value. And then we have another test that's reading at a high value and hovering this mobile app over. And you'll see that it gives a high value. And we can embed instructions. And importantly, we can transmit this data to databases, to physicians, to manage patient care. So we see this as a disruptor in the way people obtain medical information and diagnostics, a disruptor to the current model of healthcare, where we have to go to the doctor, get a venous blood draw, and then you wait 2 days to get your result through a very expensive process. This is going to put that capability in people's homes. And so we are very close to closing a strategic partnership that we've been working on for about a year. This is a major Japanese pharmaceutical company, and they too have an interest in home monitoring of liver function. And I think in a lot of ways we were pretty lucky to pick liver function as our first test because it addresses critical needs in both the developing and the developed worlds. So drug-induced liver injury, leading cause of acute liver failure in the U.S. Monitoring is very difficult. This is something you have to go into the doctor and get a blood draw to do. There's no home LFT, liver function monitoring test. And so our partner has a drug that has a liver toxicity problem. And if you can bring that capability into the home, then the FDA is a lot more comfortable with the catching the 3% of patients that are going to have liver toxicity from this drug. If they're testing monthly with a simple to use test, you're going to catch that patient, and then obviously what they're interested in is selling more drugs. And so we see this as a very nice validation of the model, where we took a developing world need and built a simple, easy to use, portable, disposable test, and that turns out to mean a great deal to a major pharma company. And so we're going through an exclusive license for their drug portfolio, and as Michael mentioned, this brings about a lot of multipliers in what we're able to do, which you see there. Thank you.
I love hearing stories where not only is Jason making a huge impact on the world, but he's doing it in such a smart way that it's going to be sustainable. You can see many examples of both multipliers and levers there. He built a great strategic partnership. And you can see that just by doing all the right things around his business model, what's an incredible innovation is going to be brought to life, but also sustained. So thank you very much. It's a wonderful story, and may there be many more that come out of Harvard as a result of that. So what's behind this is something that sometimes gets reduced to numbers. And people often talk about the basic startup model of managing things like what refer to as lifetime value of a customer and cost of acquiring your customer. And I certainly think this is an important piece of this, because you can't manage what you can't measure, is the old adage. But more importantly than that, ultimately, you do have to foot to a P&L, even if you're a not-for-profit, to figure out how you can be sustainable. So I'm just going to introduce a few basic concepts, and then I'm lucky enough to have both Dennis to highlight how his numbers work, and then Lauren to show some broader benchmarks in the industry about this. So the basic model is this, there's a cost of acquiring your customers. Think about this as your sales, your marketing costs, etc. Lauren will give you a bit more sense of the depth behind that. And obviously, you want that to be as low as possible, and you want your lifetime value of your customer to be as high as possible, the amount of money you can extract over the lifetime of working with them. It turns out that the minimum sort of ratio you want here is probably about 3x. Now, there's lots of different ways of expressing that, and there's lots of different ways that you might say it's 1x to start off with, but moving to 3x, or you need a much higher one based on what your product is. But in the end, you're going to have to figure out how to measure those things, and you're going to have to figure out how you get to a profitable business model. Now, it starts at a simple level, and I often get asked, how do we think about the phases of a company? And at the very early stages, most companies are in development stage. Almost all their expenses are in R&D, so it's sort of zero revenue and all R&D expense. So it's sort of 100% plus of your revenue is in R&D, and your loss is basically equivalent to whatever you're spending in development. As you move towards, for example, a software company model, you might look like this. You try to target a gross margin of at least 80%. Your R&D drops to being only about 15%. And this is usually a surprise to people because they all think that it's about building phenomenal products. When you get to steady state, this is usually about 1/3 the cost of your, sorry, this should say sales and marketing, not G&A. So it's usually 1/3 the cost of your sales and marketing expense. Your real cost in building a company is in reaching those customers. And that's why business model is so important. So you're trying to reduce the cost, that's where the levers come in, of reaching your customers. Because when you get to the steady state model, if you've got sales and marketing costs that are triple your development costs, and you can't get them down because you haven't got efficient ways to get to market, and you've got a tough business model, you're never going to get to this bottom line, which is to have a profit of, say, a 20% net margin. So this is why we spend so much time analyzing what's your business model like. And I'll let Dennis just describe what he's actually managing in a real world case of a company that's pre-public, but has to get itself to a model that Wall Street will understand.
You can see real life examples of these here, where we started off a few years ago spending over 50%, a full 62% of our spend, is on just the cost of delivering the service. That part we're going to bring down over time to be about 25% of the cost of 25% of revenue on the cost of delivering the service. Now, and we've already made great strides in that part of it. I mean, this is really figuring out how to do it. We bring that down dramatically over time. R&D has already come down dramatically from almost 50% of revenue. Now we're already in the below 20% of revenue on R&D. Now again, we're a special case because we can leverage the open source software. Where we're continuing to see, and again, this is all as a percentage of revenue, so smaller percentages, but as you recall, big growth in revenue. So this doesn't mean the actual dollars being spent are going down each year. The dollars are continuing to increase. And in particular, you can see from 2012 to 2013, there's a real shift in the business going on here. So these are revenues that are sort of 50% or so higher from 2012 into 2013. Yet our sales and marketing spend as a percentage of revenue is the same, which means what we're spending on sales and marketing is actually growing dramatically from 2012 to 13. And this is our investment in penetrating the enterprise market, because as Michael says, with software, it's somewhat about having the best product, but it's also very much about being in front of the customer when they're ready to make a buying decision. Most of the business we lose, most of the business that goes to someone else, are cases where we're not in the door because we didn't know about the opportunity. In my last company, we got acquired by Salesforce. For many years, and it's not the case anymore, but for many years, Salesforce had a goal that 25% of the employees in the company their goal was that 25% of the employees in the company would be quota-carrying salespeople. That doesn't include any sales support, no sales engineers. 25% of the people in the company were paid based on how much they sold that quarter. And that's what it takes to drive software businesses. Sadly for me, G&A brings up the bottom in terms of what the spend is there. And you see in the long term, it's probably, companies run about an 8 to 10% of what they spend on is on G&A. If as you're going through, say, the IPO process, that's going to spike a bit with all you need to do to get ready. But that's how the business evolves. Now that's a P&L view. I think what's more interesting is what's driving the top end of that. So, and this is what a SaaS business model looks like: software as a service. Software as a service is always a mix of what's really in your revenue. Today, 70% of the business we bring in each quarter are subscriptions. They're subscriptions to the support, the tools, the platform that we offer. But in order to get companies successful at using Drupal and at using Acquia, we also sell professional services. And about 30% of what we sell every quarter are professional services. And we want to be very careful about doing this. To what Michael was talking about earlier in terms of biz dev and partners, right? There are thousands of companies out there that have Drupal expertise. We want those companies doing the heavy lifting on professional services. But we also want our clients to be extremely successful at using Drupal. So the way we try to sell professional services is we try to be the architect of a development that a client is doing. Design, oversee the project, but use other people out there in the Drupal community, again, sort of the give more back. Give business to those smaller shops. Let them do the actual coding. Let them do the heavy lifting. Give them guidance on what we're really looking for the client. And that's why we'll keep sort of 30% of our bookings on that professional services piece. As a result of that, we have about an 85% renewal rate of those subscriptions we sell to our clients. And that's a key piece of the SaaS business model. 85% of the contracts we sell when they come up for renewal, we renew those contracts. Now, in addition, at the same time as we're doing that, we're also expanding into the organization by selling more and more contracts into those organizations. That's the land and expand strategy that Michael talked about.
I didn't ask you this, but our actual dollar renewal rate, why don't you talk about that?
Yeah,
for
dollar
a second?
renewal rate is if you include, so on a contract by contract basis, renewal rates in the 80%, in the 80% range. On a client dollar-based renewal rate, our numbers are more similar to those bar charts you showed of LTV,
Yep.
where we increase by multiples inside a company. So that renewal rate is well north of 100%.
So just think about that for a second. So we're getting renewal in dollars, thank you very much, that in the end, and actually, sorry, I cut you off on one slide here, right? Which is actually more than 100% per annum. In other words, a customer's coming back and spending more and buying more with us. And this next slide explains why, so let me just let you tee that up.
Right, yes, so we find new customers in new regions. So we have a guy in Singapore, for example, now, and he's starting to call on clients in Singapore. We just put some people in Sweden, so new geographies. New partners, so the people we talked about, the consultancies out there, getting them to bring more business to us. New verticals, we're developing a great solution for companies to use Drupal for commerce, and to penetrate the commerce vertical. And then potentially use acquisitions to fuel new products and expansion as well. That's how you get new customers. With existing customers, as we talked about, land and expand. Take one website that we run for them and make it 300 websites. New products, add security, add commerce to what they're doing already. And that all creates that land and expand strategy we've talked about that results in the 250% compound annual growth of revenue.
Great, thank you, Dennis. So this is a real-world example, and you can see that the multiple layers of the business model, each of which is enabling the company to build both its growth and its predictability. And if I went back to that RSVP model that I was describing to you, this is very repeatable and highly scalable and highly predictable. And that's what's so interesting about it, is it becomes very obvious at that point where the value is, which is you can see in a company growing like this why it's going to be valuable. And so think RSVP, think about the various different layers of it, and think about how this is going to be something you measure. So I'm very privileged to have Lauren Kelly here. Lauren runs a business called OPEX Engine, and she does broad industry benchmarking. So one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do is not to just think about your business model in isolation, but to understand how do other people measure and measure their business models, and how do you compare and contrast to them. So Lauren, come up and tell us a little bit about, for example, we've been talking about SaaS. Tell us a little bit about the differentiators on SaaS and how we might think about some of these metrics.
So my company, OPEX Engine, benchmarks companies' financials and operating metrics. So one of the ways that our disruptive business model is that we take in clean data and then we aggregate it and give it back to companies as good quality benchmarks to compare their company's performance. So what we're looking at here is, and Michael referred to this earlier, almost every industry is being disrupted. The software industry was disrupted by software as a service. So you had traditional software sales where you sold perpetual licenses, and from a business model perspective, it meant every quarter you started from zero, or every year you started from zero. Your salespeople had zero in terms of what they had accomplished. They had to sell the heck out of it. And so they had total control over what the pipeline was and the visibility of the business, and would share that with the rest of the company. Now, in a software as a service business, where you have long-term subscriptions and you have very complex revenue analyses that typically the finance organization is running. So you have a big change just within the companies, that sales no longer is really telling the rest of the company what the sales are going to be. You have the CFO, like Dennis, telling the rest of the company, here's what is expected that we're going to do this year, we're going to do next year, and with a very high degree of accuracy. And that's determined by very complex financial models based on the number of subscriptions, the churn rate, so you can assume that you're going to keep 85% or 90% as you change that, and your upsell percentages. So it's a huge difference, and it means that the metrics that you use to track the performance of your business have changed hugely. So we look at both of those models, software, traditional software, as well as SaaS metrics. We look at, particularly for SaaS performance metrics, we look at contracted monthly recurring revenues and all sorts of revenue metrics. But what's so important in the SaaS model is it's all about acquiring customers. So there's all sorts of customer metrics that you have to look at. And then how you track those numbers, customer lifetime value is, Michael referred to, is calculated by both your subscription revenue to a customer, multiply that by some lifetime, maybe 5 years, 60 months, and then multiply that by your renewal rate, so by the 0.85% if that's your renewal rate, and multiply that by your gross margin, so you're looking at the value instead of just the pure revenue that you're getting. And compare that to your cost of customer acquisition. One of the things that we work with companies is the relative relationship between these metrics. And if your cost of customer acquisition is quite high, that may not matter if your customer lifetime value is $2 million. But if your customer lifetime value is only $80,000 a year and your cost of acquiring that customer is $60,000, that's maybe not a very profitable business. So there's all sorts of metrics that you can now very carefully analyze, both the costs of your business, the predictability of your business, how the revenue is going to play out, as well as the profitability of your business. And that's ultimately how you then determine the valuation and the kind of capital that you can use to back you to keep growing and growing. So this is, I won't go into a huge amount of detail here, but one of the other issues is not just that there's all sorts of great metrics out there to build your business model with, but also that the definition of those metrics is very important. This is looking at the difference between contracted monthly recurring revenue versus just the recurring revenue that you have. You may have one-off deals. You might have some installation services that might make it look like you are building a $5 million business when you really are only building a $1 million business because you had some things that weren't actually long-term contracts. So the other point here is that the key point here is that these are not industry defined or legally or accounting defined terms. These are terms that have developed over the past 10 years, really. And so how one company defines it can be different from how another company defines it. So we're a little bit short in time, I think. But what I wanted to point out here, we do a survey every year where companies input their company data into our secure online system, and they pay us in order to do that. So it's a very good quality, and it's a service that we offer to companies. But what we find is there's lots of venture-backed firms, and there's lots of non-venture-backed firms, bootstrapped firms. And there's one huge difference between the two when you're looking at private companies, is the venture-backed firms have access to a lot of capital, and they've convinced investors that they have a huge growth model. So the capital is being used for revenue growth. So, for example, these are the venture-backed firms, and their recurring revenue growth rate, and this is just a median number. So we actually have other of the top 25%. It was actually, the median was about 200% revenue growth. So this is 65 versus the non-venture-backed firms that can't really spend over their revenue. So everything is going to be profitable. So their growth rates are lower. But then if you look at the operating income comparisons, these companies are profitable and these companies are not. So it's just a big difference in terms of looking at the kind of business that you're going to build and the kind of metrics that you want to track, and in terms of what Michael was showing you in terms of expense ratios and COGS and a variety of things. What's interesting is typically the gross margin ends up being the same, but how you get there is very, very different. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. So it's a tough subject to bring to life with a lot of numbers, but you did a great job. And I will say that we're going to post on the site, so you'll have a lot more depth behind this, the context for a lot of the things that Lauren brought up. And we thank her for doing that. The question I always get asked, of course, is, great, so I've heard all this, now how do I make something really valuable? For some reason, this seems to be stuck on everybody's mind. Well, I will say something that I've said culturally before. You build valuable businesses by doing the right things. When you do the right things come, that you deliver value to your customers. And ultimately, if you manage the right business model, you'll build value. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that if you don't think about it in advance. And so there's a wide discrepancy in values that companies get when they get public. And it's a fun thing to look at why. So, for example, some of the data that we worked on with Goldman Sachs on this would show that the median value for SaaS companies is about 5.2x revenues. But there's a massive discrepancy between some that are at 13x and some that are 1x. In fact, last time we were running this class, because they weren't public, I could have my company Demandware here. And they came in and gave the case study. And at the time, they were at about a 7x revenue. Today, if you went and looked, they're at about a 17x revenue. So why is that? Well, one reason is certainly growth. And Lauren just talked to you about this. And it's one of the reasons why people take venture money, is because they want to obviously spend to gain the growth rates and dominate a market space. But it's not the only reason one. And in fact, I'm going to pick out two that I think are important for you to understand that drive this revenue multiple. And they relate to this set of metrics we've been talking about. And they are, in particular, retention and upsell. So it turns out retention has a huge impact. If you look at the companies that have high retention, like ServiceNow, for example, or NetSuite, they have much higher multiples. And that's because obviously people can predict their business when their customers last with them for a long time. If there's high churn and they're constantly turning over, then obviously you have a much less predictable business model, and people have to worry every month about whether your customer is going to be around. So that's one very important metric. The other one is really interesting, and that's upsell. So if you have a long relationship with your customers, but you can only sell them one product, obviously you have a limited upside in your business. But if you can continue to sell them new products and services, then your upsell is going to be really interesting. And particularly if you've got long life cycle values, it turns out you've got a 14x leverage. For 2% increment in your upsell, you'll get 14x that in your valuation. So just stop and think about that for a second. What does that imply? Well, it implies that when you're designing your products and services, if you can think about ways that you can layer on value, this is the notion of the Russian doll packaging that when you go look at that workshop or you come to it next year, I'll tell you a little bit about, then you can find ways to get significant value increases over time. Now, again, all of these things aren't just in isolation. You still need long relationships with your customers that drive long life cycle value. But if I bring this all back together, what I'll say is this model that has been long put forward, that you need lifetime value and customer acquisition cost to be balanced, it's actually got to be modified a little bit to bring in these two factors of retention and upsell. And in particular, what I talk about is life cycle value of a customer. So it's extremely important that you can have an entire life cycle with your customer where you retain them. So you not just sell them the first time, but you re-engage them, they retrial, they repurchase, and then you upsell them. And then when you upsell, obviously you get that huge leverage that I just talked about. But of course, that also means you've got to look at the cost side of it too. So it's not just about the cost of acquiring them the first time, it's the cost of acquiring and re-engaging them and constantly keeping them as a customer over the years that keeps that long life cycle value. So you've got to factor in all the costs associated with the retention as well and the re-engagement. And so I encourage you to, when you do these calculations, to really think about things like your support costs, your customer services costs, your professional services costs, all the things that enable you to retain your customers and to re-engage them. And for those of you who are here for the value proposition session and heard me talk about gain pain, there are actually two views of the same principle. One side is the customer view, which is the gain that they get from you versus the pain and cost of actually acquiring the solution from you. And for the vendor, your view, it's the LCV versus the CAC. And so what's beautiful about this is there's a synergy here. When you get products that have low cost of acquisition, in other words, low pain for your customer to try and to buy, and you get high gain for your customer, and you can keep a relationship with for a long time, you get very, very exciting business models, very profitable business models, very valuable business models. And it's worth taking the time early on to establish what I believe is the key thing, which is an idea of how, even if you're not there, you intend to finish. And if you start as you plan to finish as an early company, you can be very successful. So putting it in a graphical sense, because this is sometimes hard to follow, I typically hear people talk about product life cycles in this sort of classic barbell shape. And I'm going to simplify it tonight to just keep it simple. You have what I call the see, try, buy, fly, die model. Over a period of time, customers try your product, they get to use it, and then over some period of time, they kind of give up on it and it dies. But it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, the beauty of these new kinds of models online, things like SaaS business models, is that if you build in the means to, for example, re-engage your customers, to introduce new products and services that you can upsell them around, and you build in an extended life cycle, then you can do exactly that. You can extend the life cycle and the engagement time with your customer. That gives you longer life cycle values. And in the end, if you do that in a disruptive way with some of the things that we've been talking about here, with levers that, for example, you use the web to reach your customers, just as we were hearing from Formlabs, or open source, as you're hearing from Acquia, and you'll hear from Red Hat next month. You use things like self-service for your customers to actually solve their problems online with things like forums. It turns out it's actually one of the big products that Acquia sells to companies like Twitter and Symantec, et cetera, is self-service portals for them to work with their customers and their developers. And you make it all on demand and available as a service and via subscription, and you keep adding new products and services to re-engage your customer and extending your life cycle. Guess what? Each of these things is a lever to take costs out for easier see, try, buy, and a multiplier to extend the value and the life cycle that you're delivering to a customer. and you get to a place where hopefully you don't lose customers for years. They don't die. They literally stick around for years. And I mentioned to you that, for example, Demandware's multiple has gone up from single digits to double digits now in value. It's because people are beginning to realize, wow, e-commerce websites are really sticky, and you get customers that are multi-billion-dollar customers, and they stick around for several years. That's really valuable, especially if you've got continued ability to offer them new products and services. So this is really fundamental and very disruptive, and it's all about, to summarize it in 3 words, friction-free, rapid adoption, and extended life cycles when you're developing your products and services that will ultimately drive a short but low-cost CAC, a quick payback, and an extended life cycle value. And when you do that, you see and you step back how these models have completely disrupted industries like software. In the 90s, we used to have to install software and have it customized by IT shops, and it was infrequently upgraded as a result, and was mostly proprietary and all license-based. And it was really a pretty ugly business. But today, and in this decade, everything can be web-based, self-service, on-demand, and open source based, and on a subscription model. It's much, much more predictable. And as I said, in that RSVP model, therefore much more valuable. So hopefully tonight you've got a sense of this with some real-world examples. And to summarize, we have, I believe, a case to be made here where it's just as important for you to take a step back from whatever you're innovating on and innovate around how do you create a disruptive business model. It's at least as significant as the technology disruption, in my opinion. In some instances, as I said to you earlier, can be the only thing that you disrupt. But at least think about it as something that you put an equivalent amount of emphasis on as developing your product or service. To do that, I encourage you to take away these 3 things from tonight. That you've got to figure out what your core differentiation is and focus on how you're going to monetize that. And then the other 2 things are figure out what are your multipliers and levers around that for things like co-creation or product development, as well as reach for markets and so forth. And if you can do that and you can design from the get-go how you can build long lifecycle value relationships with your customers and low cost of customer acquisition and retention, you're going to build a very valuable company. So a warm thank you to Acquia, to DFA, to Formlabs, and to OPEX Engine, and we're going to have them come up and answer questions for you. But thank you all very much for your attention tonight.